Small group dynamics and war. So we're going to consider domestic decision-making causes of war, but specifically at the level of the small decision-making group. So we've been building up to this by looking at individual decision-making psychology and some risk behavior and decision-making within crises. And now we're going to look at different theories that examine the behavior of the U.S. government during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. So President Eisenhower's nuclear policy between 1952 and 1960 was to respond to the slightest Soviet provocation with overwhelming nuclear defense, basically retaliation and destruction of the enemy target. This was termed massive retaliation. Its benefit was that it required a very small conventional force, but its drawback was it wasn't very credible. The Soviets may simply not believe that the US would start a nuclear war over such a small territorial attack on a minor country, such as West Berlin or Taiwan. You can see here West Berlin, and there were 3 air corridors and road corridors that allowed Western countries, particularly the French, American, and British defenders of Berlin, to get access to the city. And there are over 1 million residents living in the city, isolated deep within East Germany. Now, the massive retaliation policy applied less as the Soviet nuclear arsenal increased, and President Kennedy in 1961, the new American president, introduced flexible response to increase the credibility of a U.S. military response. Kennedy's Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, designed a second strike arsenal that could kill about 25 to 30% of the Russian population and destroy 2/3 of the Soviet industrial capacity. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union would manage to deploy 1,000 ICBMs. But in 1962, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union probably had no missiles that could reach the continental US. Here you can see Soviet ICBMs, and some are listed as many as 75 that could reach the US in 1962, but that is still being debated. There's memoirs of Khrushchev, or of his family members, who indicate that Russia had no operational ICBMs at the time. Kennedy had campaigned for president on the basis of the existence of a missile gap. He basically accused the previous government of Eisenhower of having neglected its responsibility to build missiles, and that the Soviets were getting ahead. But in reality, and Kenny knew through classified briefings, that the Soviet Union had no missiles capable of reaching the mainland at the time that the missile gap was an issue during the election. On June 3rd to 4th, 1961, in Vienna, the Russian leader Khrushchev met Kennedy, and he judged him to be weak and gullible. And this was only confirmed when Cuba's revolution was permitted to consolidate. And when the Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA operation in which Cuban exiles were landed to try to overthrow the Fidel Castro government, when that failed on April 15th to 20th, 1961, and when Kennedy backed down during the 1961 Berlin crisis, when the East Germans built the Berlin Wall to stop the flight of what was up to then 20% of the East German population, mostly the young that had escaped to West Germany, Eisenhower, in contrast, had been very aggressive. He had threatened to use nuclear weapons, both to end the Korean War, although he did it not directly in the negotiations, as well as to deter the Chinese from taking Taiwan in 1958. So Khrushchev decided to place 36 intermediate range and medium range ballistic missiles in Cuba to overcome the Soviet nuclear weakness relative to the US. And Khrushchev obtained permission from Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader, by arguing that the weapons were there to protect Cuba from an invasion. Castro wanted the weapons to be deployed openly, because of course it would enhance Cuba's status and its security. But the Russians refused. This was termed Operation Anadir, and the missiles could reach about 80 million Americans. Khrushchev did not realize that the military had exaggerated their ability to hide the missile deployments to Cuba. So you can see the geography. The Soviet Union had missiles that could reach Europe, and the Americans had missiles in Italy and Turkey that could reach the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union couldn't directly threaten the US without launching bombers. And most of the bombers would have been intercepted in the Arctic or while flying over the Arctic of Canada. And the Soviet Union only had about 150 bombers. So the vast majority of the bombers would have been destroyed. By taking missiles from the Soviet Union and moving them across to Cuba, immediately the US was put under a direct nuclear threat. And this supplemented the nuclear missiles that were few in number that could be deployed by submarine off the US coast. So what was the military balance? Well, in October of 1962, the US was in a far better position to inflict damage on the Soviet Union than vice versa. The Soviet Union had an ICBM that was just going into service, but was probably not yet ready at the time of the crisis. The US had around 1,500 bombers, 294 Titan ICBMs, which were introduced in 1959, and 144 sea-launched ballistic missiles that could be launched by submarine, the Polaris missile. The Soviet Union had a few hundred intermediate-range ballistic missiles, but they only had between none and 75 SS-7 ICBMs. Here you can see an SS-4 with a 1 megaton warhead, the SS-5 Skeen with a 1 megaton warhead, the SS-7 Sandler, which is the largest of all the missiles there, and they had SSN-4s, which was a missile on 39 ballistic missile submarines. But these missile submarines were very low endurance and couldn't stay off the US coast for very long. On Cuba, according to the Army Chief of Operations, General Anatoly Kripkov, there were 42 medium-range ballistic SS-4 and SS-5 missiles, what the Russians termed the R-12. There were 6 training rockets and 36 missiles with warheads. But these missiles were not yet operational. They were still being set up for preparation and launch. The Soviets also had Meteor launchers with 80 warheads. These are short, tactical, ranged warheads. They also had 6 to 12 tactical Luna 40-kilometer range rockets. And they had Ilyushin-28 Beagle medium jet bombers, which could have been equipped with bombs, but were not. Now, the free fire for the tactical nuclear weapons, the Meteor and the Luna weapons, was given if the Soviet forces in Cuba could not contact Moscow. But these missiles couldn't hit the US. They were primarily intended to be dropped on the beaches, destroying American Marines as they landed. So here is the relative balance between the Soviet and the US forces in the lead-up and in the period shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the chronology. July 26, 1962, the first Russian ships arrive in Cuba with missiles. 85 ships do 184 trips covertly, smuggling the missiles into Cuba. On September 12th, Kennedy publicly opposes an invasion of Cuba. On September 13th, Kennedy warns the Soviet Union against any offensive buildup in Cuba, including military and nuclear forces. On October 14th, Sunday, a U-2 aircraft provides the first photograph of missiles in Cuba. So that's the date that the crisis begins. Here we have a medium-range ballistic missile site at San Cristobal. This is a picture taken on October 27th, and visible in the picture are launchers and bunkers. This picture was taken on October 14th, 2 weeks earlier. It's the MRBM launch site at San Cristobal. This is a medium-range ballistic missile site picture at San Cristobal on November 1st. This picture was taken as verification following the picture in late October. This is the missile MRBM launch site at San Cristobal, taken on October 14th. A different perspective. On October 16th, Tuesday, Kennedy was told that the missiles were detected on Cuba. So this is a delay of 2 days. Kennedy summoned the executive committee and met at 11:15 a.m. In the first meeting. The meetings were secretly recorded, which is, of course, a trove of research data for political scientists. Later that day, Rocky and Bullwinkle, or two individuals dressed up as them, publicly drove their truck onto the White House lawn unannounced as a part of a publicity campaign. And it was thought that they were Soviet commandos, so they were immediately arrested and dragged into the basement and interrogated. On October 22nd, Monday, President Kennedy announces that missiles were detected on Cuba and begins invasion preparations. So here you have public panic. On October 23rd, Tuesday, a quarantine is placed around Cuba by the United States Navy, blocking all ships entering and leaving. On October 24th to 29th was the high point of the crisis. So this is the approximate area of the quarantine enforced by Task Force 136. But you can see it's not, not entirely clear. In some of the dimensions, the quarantine was actually farther out than depicted in this picture. So what we're going to do is look at the decisions by the U.S. from different theoretical perspectives. These perspectives come from Graham Allison and his book, The Essence of Decision, which was an application of these models to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in Model 1, we have the rational policy model. Model 1 assumes that states are rational, unitary actors, that the actors are their governments, and that they choose their actions on the basis of a rational comparison of different policy alternatives in order to maximize their gains. It's a simplifying assumption. It's typical of rational choice and realism. To uncover why a state enacted a policy, one simply needs to determine the goal of that policy. So this is the rational model we looked at earlier. So in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the rational policy model explanation of Soviet-American behavior assumes two propositions on the practice of nuclear deterrence that were central to the Cuban Missile Crisis. One, second strike nuclear deterrence reduces the likelihood of nuclear war because when both sides have a guaranteed portion of their forces that will survive an attack and can be used for retaliation and will inflict enough damage in that retaliation, neither side can gain anything from an initial attack. Attacking first or attacking second makes no difference. Number two, nonetheless, states will seek first strike capabilities and nuclear superiority in the belief that it is possible to obtain a sufficiently large advantage that the second strike capabilities of the enemy can be overcome. So it's one of those paradoxes, which is nuclear deterrence can be solid, but states never stop looking for nuclear superiority, even though second strike logic tells us you can never get nuclear superiority. You can never be so superior that you can completely destroy an opponent so they can't retaliate. It would require probably a 10-to-1 ratio of nuclear warheads. So the final decision can be described as having followed the rational policy model. ExComm, the executive committee of the National Security Council, was comprised of 14 advisors plus the U.S. President John F. Kennedy. ExComm proposed 6 basic courses of action. 1. Do nothing. Since the U.S. was already under nuclear weapons threat, additional weapons in Cuba would have no impact. Well, critics of this proposal argued that it would permit the Soviet Union to build cheaper, shorter-range missiles, to bypass the U.S. early warning network located in the Arctic, which was the path of the Soviet bombers and the Soviet ICBMs. It was a 7-minute flying time to hit the U.S. with rockets from Cuba, whereas it was a 45-minute flying time to hit the U.S. with missiles from the Soviet Union. And it would undermine U.S. credibility among its allies, leading the allies to build their own nuclear weapons, Germany, Japan, Italy, leading to proliferation of nuclear weapons. Number 2, diplomatic pressure. It was proposed to communicate directly or indirectly with Khrushchev over the reciprocal removal of 15 Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy. These missiles were going to be replaced anyway, and replaced by Polaris missiles deployed on ballistic missile submarines in the Mediterranean, and to neutralize Cuba. Critics argued that international fora such as the UN could be immobilized by the Soviet Union's veto power, and to offer a quid pro quo, a trade, would hand Khrushchev the diplomatic initiative. Option 3. Secret approach to Fidel Castro. Here you can see Eisenhower's vice president at the time, Nixon, shaking hands with Fidel Castro. Provide Fidel Castro with an ultimatum to force the Soviets to leave or face an attack. The critics argued that Fidel Castro had actually no influence over the Soviets. Option 4. Invasion. Attack Cuba. Remove Castro and the missiles. The U.S. had gathered a force of 180,000 soldiers that would have had to oppose the Cuban armed forces of around 100,000 and 42,000 Soviet troops. This would have led to a retaliatory move by the Soviets against West Berlin, which would have led directly into combat with American, British, and French garrisons, and possibly an escalation of war in Europe and elsewhere. Option 5, a surgical strike. Bomb the missile sites before the missile sites became operational. Probably by using about 500 bomber sorties. The critics argued that the Air Force could not guarantee that all the sites would be destroyed. Some of them could be launched. Russian soldiers would very likely be killed, and this would lead to retaliation against Americans in Berlin or against other American allies like Turkey. Option 6, blockade. The U.S. blockade of Cuba. It was regarded as only moderately provocative to the Soviet Union. It put Khrushchev in the position of having to decide the outcome by granting him the choice to pull ships back. And it played on U.S. conventional military preponderance in the Caribbean. The critics argued that the Soviet Union could retaliate by blockading West Berlin. And then the restored status quo ante would permit them time to complete the construction of the missile sites. As well, if the Soviets ignored the blockade, the U.S. would have to fire the first shots. So it's sort of it's a psychological question. Who actually has the last best chance to control the situation in the blockade? Now, initially, Kennedy and the majority of ex-com preferred the airstrike option. But after Kennedy conferred on October 21st with General Walter C. Sweeney, he was convinced that the Air Force could not guarantee a greater than 90% probability of success. A single operational missile site could launch a large enough number of missiles to devastate a number of cities. Kennedy decided on the blockade, stressing its key advantage of providing the Soviets sufficient space to back down. The two key points that led to his decision were: 1, the public perception of the immorality of a surprise attack on Cuba, and 2, the impossibility of a guaranteed airstrike. In that context, the American reaction to the Soviet missiles on Cuba was rational. It calculated that the Soviet Union, the marginally weaker party, could not escalate the dispute to an unlimited war that would lead to many more Russians being killed than Americans, unless the Russians were provoked through direct military action. Now, the problem with the rational policy model, Model 1, is that according to games theory, there is no such thing as an optimal collective decision-making model, or even democracy, if by democracy we mean all those values and procedures we believe give it legitimacy and make it different from non-democratic processes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau developed the idea of the general will to argue for democracy. He argued that you could have a legislature, and the individuals there would represent their constituencies, and together, through the combination of the individual representation, they would represent the general will of society. This is the underlying assumption of the rational policy model when you have a committee or collective decision-making process. MJAN de Carita Marquis de Condorcet, who lived from 1743 to 1794, is a French scientist, a revolutionary, and a political theorist. And he worked as a mathematician at the Academy of Sciences in Paris. He applied probability theory to the social sciences. And he created what is now called the Condorcet paradox. He argued that as the number of actors and preferences increases, there will be an increased likelihood of cycling. Cycling means that collectively there will be no consistent social preference ordering. In other words, there won't be a transitive social preference. Rather, you'll have an intransitive social preference. Now, this could be solved using a mixed game strategy. But it can't be solved using a strategy of domination. So a transitive social preference would be something like A is better than B is better than C, and therefore A is better than C. Very logical. But he argues that in collective decision making, that assumption breaks down. So here's an example of cycling. We have 3 voters, 1, 2, and 3, headed the 3 columns. We have 3 preference orderings of policies, first, second, and third, represented by X, Y, and Z as the policies in whatever order the preference is in the rows. So we would conduct an election. So let's say we conduct an election between policies X and Y. So who's going to vote for X? Well, voter 1 prefers X to Y, voter 2 prefers X to Y, but voter 3 prefers Y to X. So X would beat Y. Let's compare then Y to Z. Voter 1 prefers Y to Z. Voter 2 prefers Z to Y. Voter 3 prefers Y to Z. So Y would beat Z. Now let's compare X and Z. Voter 1 prefers X to Z. Voter 2 prefers Z to X. Voter 3 prefers Z to X. Now this has created an intransitive and inconsistent social preference ordering. X is both better than Y, and as a consequence better than Z as a preference, but it's also worse than Z. So Z is greater than X is greater than Y is greater than Z. So the outcome, the ultimate outcome of the policy depends not on the preference order of the policies, it depends instead on the voting procedure, the agenda. And the agenda is simply the manipulation of the order of voting. So the agenda determines the outcome, not the actual preferences. This is a major problem. It means that preferences don't matter. So the Condorcet paradox demonstrates that states do not make decisions as if they were unitary rational actors. Now again, you could solve this and come to a probabilistic outcome using a mixed game strategy. But you can't roll dice when you come up with policies, so it's not a practical solution. You have to choose one of the policies, especially if the policies contradict each other. So let's look at an example which you're going to have to apply in an assignment. So here's a description of an event. Nikita Khrushchev and his advisors, Dobrynin and Gromyko, sit down to discuss what can be done about Cuba shortly after their meeting with John F. Kennedy in Vienna. Each of these leaders has a different preference over 3 possible choices. 1, nuke America. 2, do nothing. And 3, put missiles on Cuba. They sit down and try to vote to see which is the best plan. Now, Dobrynin, he's a hardliner and would like to see America on fire. Failing that, he would like to put missiles on Cuba and threaten America. He least wants to do nothing. Gromyko is more calm. He wants to do nothing. He's a diplomat. But if you have to do something against America, you should attack it rather than going through the half measure of placing missiles on Cuba. Khrushchev would like to put missiles on Cuba because he likes risky adventures. But otherwise, the status quo is fine. He certainly does not want to attack America. It would lead to a massive retaliation and destruction of the Soviet Union under his watch. So these are the preferences, the first, second, and third of Khrushchev, Dobrynin, and Gromyko. So we would compare the proposals to see who would win. So missiles on Cuba versus Nuke America. Well, Khrushchev would give 1 vote, and then Dobrynin and Gromyko would have 2 votes. Nuke America would get 1 vote from Dobrynin. Do Nothing would get 2 votes from Khrushchev and Gromyko. And in the third vote, Do Nothing would get 1 vote from Gromyko, and missiles on Cuba would get 2 votes from Khrushchev and Dobrynin. So in effect, we have cycling. Missiles on Cuba is weaker than Nuke America, which is weaker than Do Nothing, which is weaker than missiles on Cuba. So this cycling of preferences is called the intransitive preference ordering. A transitive preference ordering would be A is better than B, B is better than C, such that A is better than C. And here, that is not true. Now, because the agenda matters in what order the issues are raised, and Khrushchev wants his proposal to win, as chairman of the Supreme Soviet, he can decide in what order to raise the issue. So here we have agenda control. So Khrushchev is thereby able to eliminate his least desirable outcome by setting up a vote between Nuke America and Do Nothing. So in the first vote, between Nuke America and Do Nothing, Nuke America is defeated, it's taken out. So Do Nothing wins. In the second voting round, because again, Khrushchev is the president, so he controls the vote agenda, the vote is between Do Nothing and missiles on Cuba. And Do Nothing only has 1 vote from Gromyko, and missiles on Cuba gets the vote from Dobrynin and Khrushchev, so Khrushchev is thereby able to eliminate his least desirable outcome, nuking America. And he gets his preference of putting missiles on Cuba. So Khrushchev is very happy with the decision of the Supreme Soviet and orders missiles to Cuba. So this is the structure that you have to adopt in your assignment. But in addition, your assignment actually has more than one solution. So you need to check to see if which of your questions in the problem has more than one solution. Now this is a much more complicated representation of the interaction of the number of policy alternatives, which here goes up to 49, and the number of voters, which goes up to infinite. When you have an infinite number of voters and you have 49 alternatives, the probability of cycling is, as you can see in the bottom right, 84%. In other words, complexity almost automatically produces cycling, which means the policy itself is not that important. What matters, now it doesn't mean all the policies cycle with all the policies. Many of the policies would be eliminated as being transitively having no collective preference. But you're going to get some cycling among the remaining policies, which is why it's so important to control the agenda and to be familiar with the rules on committee decision making. Because the process of decision making is often more important for influencing the outcome than the policy preference of the actors. KJ Arrow applied games theory to democracy. And this is called the Arrow's Impossibility Theorem. Now, we would like a good democratic procedure to satisfy some criteria of fairness as well as of logicality. Arrow's startling proof shows that the set of extremely weak criteria on democracy is inconsistent. Simply put, it means that to have a democracy, you need a method of choosing, implementing, and enforcing a voting procedure or agenda, all of which contradicts the basic assumptions of democracy as being free. So this axiomatic approach condenses all the basic democratic assumptions and tests them for compatibility. So you have the assumption of A1, collective rationality. The social preference function satisfies assumptions 1 and 2, complete and transitive assumptions. Assumption 2 is the unrestricted domain. Every individual preference relation that satisfies assumptions 1 and 2 is admissible. Assumption 3, the Pareto principle. If xp underscore iy for all persons L in a group, then xpy in the social preference order. Assumption 4, independence. If R is a profile of individual preferences over some set of alternatives that includes x and y, if GR, given the set of xy, is equal to xpy, and if R prime is another preference profile, such that each person's preference between x and y is the same in R prime as in R, then GR prime set xy is equal to xpy. And finally, A5, non-dictatorship. No person I is decisive for every pair of outcome in O. But because someone's going to control the agenda, assumption 5 must exist in a democracy, but assumption 5 contradicts the earlier assumptions. Arrow's impossibility theorem therefore challenges Jean-Jacques Rousseau's conception of the general will, that there is such a thing. So, if O consists of 3 or more outcomes, the only institutions, G, that satisfy conditions A through 4 are institutions that violate condition 5, which is non-dictatorship. So if a choice or ordering system, such as an electoral procedure, produces results that are transitive and consistent and satisfies the universal domain, that is, it works for all possible combinations of individual preferences, and it satisfies the weak Pareto condition, and is independent of irrelevant alternatives, that is, dictatorial. Dictatorial here has a technical meaning, namely that the preference of one individual may determine the social choice, irrespective of the preference of any other individual in that society. It is therefore nonsense to claim that a policy represents the will of the people, since the will of the people depends on the process of representation, which distorts, one way or another, the outcome. There is no automatic method of aggregating the social interest. So now we go to Model 2, the organizational process model. This is the second of Graham Allison's models. Governments are not in reality unitary rational actors, but are in fact a set of interacting different organizations, each with their own goals and procedures. Their organizational processes detect and define problems. They provide and implement alternatives, and they constrain to a large extent the policy choices of their leaders. Governments rely on a number of specialized organizations to execute all the tasks relevant to the conduct of governing. Individuals within organizations rely on routines and standard operating procedures, SOPs, to execute the task of the organization. Governmental leaders can at best operate within the organizational processes. They must employ capabilities within these limits, although they have some capacity in combining these organizational outputs. Now, I'll give you some personal perspective of mine. I served in the military for a while, 15 years. I was an operations officer. My job was to plan and execute operations for my commander. I'm an Army engineer. I build minefields, I remove booby traps, I build bridges, I do general military construction, and I provide infrastructure support for river crossings. I help the military go where they want to go. I've had to cooperate with armored people, with artillery people, with infantry. In the engineers, we have a philosophy, which is you can never defeat physics. I've seen people violate that rule, and I've seen 100-ton bridges calmly roll into the water and disappear because people violated physical laws. The infantry, on the other hand, they like to run up and down hills, screaming, attacking the enemy. They do it because their job requires a great deal of courage. But very often I see them violating laws of physics and failing rather abruptly. We like to think that it's easy for people in different government organizations to just get together. But once you have spent 10 years at your job and you're an expert and you are very familiar with all of the details of that job, you generally don't know the details of other people's jobs. Pilots like to bomb. Artillery people like to shell. But you can't bomb and artillery a location at the same time because the artillery shells could shoot down the aircraft. Armored operators like to move very quickly across the terrain. Engineers, we don't. We have lots of delicate equipment we need to move securely. So working together with people with different technical backgrounds is harder than you think. It's not automatic. It can be done, but it requires an enormous amount of training. So these are the propositions of the organizational process model. 1. Organizations operate according to routines and standard operating procedures that permit their efficient specialization, but at the same time limit their ability to adapt to new circumstances. For example, police organizations perform better at law enforcement than providing, for example, social services, or even military capacity, though they train for all of those things. Number 2, standard operating procedures. These are routines to deal with standard situations. Without SOPs, an individual approach to each problem would raise the cost in terms of time and applied resources. How would Canada react if Toronto were suddenly destroyed by a nuclear weapon? Well, poorly, because we have very few SOPs developed for dealing with that scale of a contingency. Number 3, organizations are at best capable of incremental change, and at worst, they resist change. However, they will adapt and learn depending on their routines. During the Cold War in the late 1970s, the RCMP was responsible for counterintelligence. A group of Canadian communists decided to hold a meeting in a barn. The RCMP would normally bug those meetings. When the RCMP went to the barn and noticed there was no electrical outlets from which to get electrical power for their bug, they burned down the barn. The ensuing domestic crisis led the Canadian government to create CSIS and gave it the responsibility of doing these types of investigations. Proposition 4. Intra-organizational resource distributions change incrementally. So convincing the Canadian military, for example, to be more accepting of peacekeeping operations took about 10 years. It took a very long time. The military just didn't feel that it should be its mission, and so it resisted. Issue number 5, cybernetic decision-making. Now this does not mean robotic decision-making, but it's a type of parts process decision-making. Cybernetic decision-making argues that policy decisions are normally too complex to be handled by any single organization, and therefore has its components subdivided between different specialized organizations. Cybernetics argues that dysfunctions occur when a single component of a decision-making process is excluded, perhaps unintentionally, thereby creating a distorted output that is not detectable by the other organizations. Sub-organizations, because they lack the full picture, do not optimize. Instead, they follow a behavior called satisficing. They look for the first good solution regardless of the overall goal. For example, it's believed that the exclusion of civilian foreign affairs in the decision-making of military governments leads them to exaggerate the commitment of allies. I can tell you my research on and my research time in Pakistan largely confirms that. Pakistan did poorly against India mostly because they consistently marginalized their foreign ministry. And this was because the military created a cybernetic dysfunction in Islamabad, but didn't recognize what they had done. Proposition 6. Organizations may suffer from the need to recoup sunk costs in order to justify expenditures and justify its budget. And we saw that trying to recoup sunk costs is like a gambler, and it's dysfunctional. Proposition 7, the principal-agent problem. This is a term used to describe a phenomenon where it's difficult for the leadership to control their subordinates. And this is very often a problem in political processes. Ensuring that the policy is formulated by the agent is the one that is executed by the principal is complex. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the military was raised to DEFCON Condition 2, the Air Force announced it over the radio in the clear in order to signal it to the Soviets. And this was against the wishes of the Executive Committee, which thought it was provocative. Proposition 8, the collective action problem. The greater the number of principals having to agree or execute a policy, the greater the difficulty in ensuring conformity with the goal. This is difficult because of, one, the calculation problem, which makes coming to a negotiated solution difficult because of the exponential increase in complexity with the arithmetic increase in the number of principals. 2, the sanctioning problem, in which the increased number of players increases the cost of coordinating punishment for non-cooperators against the incentive to free ride. During the Vietnam War, the Army refused to learn from the application of local counterinsurgency strategies by the U.S. Marine Corps, despite the success of the Marine Corps. The Johnson administration simply did not have sufficient control in order to ensure that the military was forced to learn from the Marines. So let's apply some of these propositions to outcomes and behaviors during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So case number 1, intelligence error. The United States Intelligence Board, the USIB, in its September 19, 1962 estimate, concluded that the Soviet Union was not about to introduce missiles in Cuba. A key piece of information noted by the shipping experts was that lumber ships were riding high in the ocean surface, indicating that they were carrying bulky but light materials, obviously missiles without their fuel. However, this information was outside of the Intelligence Committee's routine of analysis and was therefore ignored as an indicator that military material was being smuggled into Cuba. A CIA agent's sighting of the rear end of a missile in Cuba that occurred on September 12th took 9 to 12 days to be received in Washington because of the organizational routine of gathering, securely transmitting, and then analyzing the data. It wasn't recognized that that piece of data was vital and should have been accelerated. Case 2, an application of cybernetics. Evidence of cybernetics included the invasion received disproportionately more interest than the airstrike initially because of the high number of aerial sorties required for a bombing campaign. The high number of sorties were calculated by assuming that the MRBM sites on Cuba were mobile. In other words, they could move quickly on trucks. And referring to the standard operating procedures to deal with mobile targets, which was based on a contingency to bomb Cuba in the event of a Soviet grab for Berlin. When it was discovered that the MRBMs were not mobile, but were mobile in the sense of being disassemblable in 6 days, the sorties were estimated significantly at a lower number. Number 3, the case of a blockade. Kennedy's goal was to enforce a blockade sufficiently close to Cuba that it gave Khrushchev time to decide to turn the Soviet ships back. However, the Navy enforced its own blockade plan of 150 ships because the Navy plan fitted better with Navy SOPs. So evidence for this was provided by the Navy's interception of vessels outside of the perimeter and the arrival on October 26th of a Soviet tanker into Havana Harbor, which had run the blockade, but which was simply not stopped because it was inside the Navy's SOP perimeter around Cuba. So there were some instances in which counterfactually war could have occurred as a result of this type of organizational dysfunction. The U.S. Navy, in this first case, has various protocols for dealing with threats. It is possible that a Soviet submarine in the area might have led the U.S. to dropping of sonobuoys. These are basically loud in some cases, in other cases silent microphones. This could have provoked the sub into evasive maneuvers. Or a Soviet aircraft might have conducted a simulated attack. Any of these could have led a ship commander taking independent action against what was and what could be thought of as a presumed threat, thereby provoking a Soviet reaction in turn. And then violence would escalate into a war. The third of Allison's models is the bureaucratic politics model. In a bureaucratic politics model of decision-making, bargaining occurs along regularized channels among a multiplicity of players, positioned hierarchically within the government. And these players bargain for a variety of national, organizational, and personal goals. Organizational decentralization, slack, or discretion permits players the freedom to negotiate. And it is this process of the political space of bargaining and compromise that produces policy outcomes. Policies are rarely the decision of one individual. When the Department of National Defense in Canada has a policy, they don't just write the document and send it down. There are documents actually written at the lower levels, and then it's circulated among the leaders of the different branches and the different segments of the headquarters, and it's brought back and then rewritten with all of the compromise and then redistributed. And this is an iterative process that actually takes many months. Where you sit determines where you stand. This is a famous quote from the bureaucratic politics model. Individuals bargain on behalf of and in the interest of their organizations in order to mobilize the support of the organization for themselves. Bargainers are consequently less concerned with the overall issue than the impact it has on their own goals. Now, there was a case in the British Royal Navy at the turn of the 20th century of a dispute over naval funds. The Secretary of the Admiralty argued for more money to build ships, but the Exchequer, which is the foreign ministry in England, said no. They refused. There simply wasn't enough money. Then, following a bureaucratic and political reshuffling and change of appointments, the two individuals actually found that they had switched their jobs. And they took up the exact same issue they had adopted earlier. The new Secretary of the Admiralty changed his policy and asked for money for ships, and the new Secretary of the Exchequer changed their position and said no. So bargaining does not occur in an open space, but within specified and situationally determined channels. Intelligence reports go from the CIA to the White House, and they can be leaked to the press in the event of a leak. Personality and less tangible factors that determine bargaining performance do matter. What personality a person has is important. Negotiators that represent and fight for positions on the basis of narrow self-interest are normally unable to aggregate the numbers necessary to implement policy. This requires coalitions that are obtained through vote trading, in which two groups promise mutual support in different issue areas, and this often requires both parties to sacrifice some amount of their own personal interest. Players therefore vote strategically in such a fashion as to obtain a positive outcome rather than voting sincerely on a policy. Comprehensive vote trading can lead to a dysfunction called log rolling, in which multiple policy packages are moved in unintended directions because of the composition of the compromise that the players are locked into if they want to get their goal satisfied. This is a picture of a U-2 aircraft. So let's apply this model, the bureaucratic politics model 3. The reconnaissance delay. On October 4th, 1962, the U.S. intelligence community decided there was sufficient evidence of the Soviet missile buildup in Cuba to authorize a U-2 flight over the country. Pretty straightforward. However, a dispute between the U.S. Air Force and the CIA over whom had the right to fly the mission led to a 10-day delay. On October 4th, the Air Force argued that given the high probability of a downed aircraft over Cuba because of the missiles and interceptors there, it would be preferable if the CIA did not conduct the mission. But the CIA argued that the Air Force was unfamiliar with its specially modified U-2s. On October 9th, 1962, it was decided that the Air Force would fly the mission. But apparently the mission fell into technical difficulties, which prompted the CIA to reopen the debate. It was finally decided that the CIA would train an Air Force pilot to fly a CIA U-2, which was conducted on October 14, 1962. The specific goal of conducting a mission over Cuba succumbed to a territorial dispute between the Air Force and the CIA over the control of airborne reconnaissance assets. Impeachment. Kennedy was being treated rather harshly by his Republican critics for his failure to address seriously the threat emanating from Cuba. When, on August 22nd, John McCone outlined suspicions of Soviet activity on Cuba, Kennedy disregarded it as a hawkish, Republican-influenced interpretation of events. He had bet his career on stating that there was no Soviet buildup on Cuba on September 4th, 1962. Thereafter, fearful of Kennedy's dismissive reaction, there was a reluctance on the part of key intelligence officials in his administration to confront him. Following the shooting down of a U-2 over China on September 9th, it was decided to reroute the U-2s over Cuba away from high-danger portions of the island. On September 13th, President Kennedy and his administration denied any activity on Cuba before a congressional committee. Beginning in late September, the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA accumulated sufficient evidence to convince hawkish advisors of Kennedy to authorize an overflight on October 4th. The overflight provided the evidence needed to confront Kennedy directly about Soviet activity on Cuba. Kennedy's visible reluctance to accept the hawkish interpretation of events required such a high standard of information that Kennedy's receipt of the vital information was delayed. In this case, it was difficult to come to a bargain with Kennedy. At 9 a.m., October 16th, McGeorge Bundy told Kennedy that there was hard photographic evidence of a Soviet presence on Cuba. And Kennedy was both shocked and angered, particularly at Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, for having lied to him in personal exchanges. As he had publicly placed his presidential reputation on the line, Kennedy was warned by his brother, Robert Kennedy, and admitted that to escape congressional impeachment, he would have to act quickly and decisively. So the final decision for the blockade was as such. An initial informal vote indicated support for the airstrike option, but the final decision evolved out of the various positions of the 15 persons in XCOM. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, depicted here in the bottom right, argued that whether the missiles were in Cuba or the Soviet Union, and whether the U.S. outnumbered the Soviet Union or was itself outnumbered 7-1, did not matter to the strength of deterrence. The Assistant for National Security Affairs, McGeorge Bundy, argued for diplomacy, but this may have been the result of his involvement over the Bay of Pigs fiasco, where the U.S. CIA-sponsored invasion of Cuba failed. Initially, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, depicted here in the bottom left, discussed a justification for war, taking to the main fiasco that it caused the Spanish-American War of 1899, and he argued that war would be better sooner rather than later, meaning 6 to 12 months later. However, he would change and did not want his brother trapped into the logic of having to take military action, as had befallen the Japanese prior to Pearl Harbor, and he argued against such an attack on moral grounds. Special Counsel Theodore Sorensen recommended a soft response. That's him depicted in the top right. In contrast, the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted an invasion of Cuba. CI Director John McCone sought an airstrike. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Paul Nitze, Dean Acheson all supported the airstrike. And Paul Nitze at least wanted to seize the Soviet ships instead of simply blockading them. Dean Rusk said, quote, "We ourselves are not moved to general war. We're simply doing what we said we would do if they took a certain action. Or we're going to decide that this is the time to eliminate the Cuban problem by actually eliminating the island," close quote. Ultimately, Kennedy decided on the basis of the low probability of the complete success of an airstrike. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara said, quote, "I do not believe we can state that we can knock them out before they can be launched. If they are launched, there is almost certain to be chaos in part of the East Coast or the area in a radius 600 to 1,000 miles from Cuba," close quote. So, how do we link this to the causes of war? Well, had the bureaucratic politics been such that Kennedy was significantly weaker and therefore had to succumb to Republican pressure from Barry Goldwater and Strom Thurmond to adopt the Joint Chiefs of Staff position on an invasion of Cuba, a war would have followed by design. On October 29, 1962, Khrushchev submitted because of the blockade, combined with an implicit threat that the U.S. would attack. So the threat of U.S. attack was there. It was tangible. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw nuclear missiles from Cuba. On December 3rd, Kennedy lifted the quarantine when the Soviets withdrew bombers from Cuba. The result was both the beginning of a nuclear arms control dialogue between the superpowers and an acceleration in the development of a broad range of nuclear forces that brought both arsenals from several hundreds to the tens of thousands by the 1980s. Now, I have a broad criticism, which I call parallelism, which is when you want to decompose these decisions with these micro mechanisms, you do get a lot of detail and you're able to test various models of decision making. But is it parsimonious? I mean, isn't realism just a lot more efficient because it comes to the same conclusions with far less mechanisms and assumptions? You have principal agent problem, the collective action problem, cybernetic decision making, you have prospect theory, you have bureaucratic bargaining. There's just so many parts. And so parallelism is, there's different ways to look at a problem. You could look at the mechanisms, and really this is more of an explanation than it is of a prediction. But it does have these reproducible components like cybernetic decision making, which makes it also predictive. So when you apply these techniques, you need to ask yourself, am I predicting a cause of war better? Is realism insufficient as a predictor of a cause of war or peace, and do I have to descend to this more complex and detailed level? And these techniques cannot always be applied because of delays in getting access to information. So it's probably far better applied to distant historical cases when most of the key individuals have written their memoirs.